About taxation and finance and politics. First, we need to cover the definition of the GDP. The GDP is the gross domestic product. It's the total value of all goods and services produced in the United States within a year. So this tells us the size of the United States economy. State and local government expenditures are about 11% of the total GDP. These costs usually focus on education, social services, public safety, and transportation. So a tax burden has to do with the amount of money a person pays of their income or of their assets or holdings towards their tax bill. And usually, the more income somebody has, the larger their tax burden, or the more they own, the larger their tax burden. There are a couple ways to think about tax burdens. We think about them in terms of progressivity and regressivity. Most taxes are thought about as regressive. This is mostly because of the use of property tax and sales tax. Property tax is on property that folks own. That could be their home. That could be cars. It depends from place to place. And sales tax, which you are probably familiar with, is to do with the tax that you pay on items that you buy in sales. There are some exemptions in sales tax for things that are of necessity. Food, for example, in the DC City Council, they heard legislation to eliminate taxes on sanitary napkins and tampons for women, arguing that those were necessities as well. Many states have a homestead exemption, which says that if you have a property, some portion of your property or some portion of the income, some portion of that asset will not be taxed as a way to try to influence or encourage folks to continue to buy property. Now we'll talk about some of the types of taxes. We talked about local property tax. Local property tax is the largest source of revenue for local governments. It's usually a regressive tax, where regressive is defined as one that disproportionately charges folks who have less, and progressive is one that charges more folks who have more. State sales tax is also an important source of revenue for state governments, and again, that will be some percentage of tax that you pay on everything that you purchase from a store. Selective sales taxes or excise taxes are taxes that are specific to particular situations. So those exist for cigarettes, alcohol, gas. In DC, for example, there's a prepared food tax of 10% that you pay on any food that is prepared before you buy it, or any restaurant food that you get. And how states or localities deal with those taxes varies from place to place.
It's 6 o'clock.
And then there's state income tax. State income tax is imposed by all but 7 states. They can either be progressive or flat. There are various exemptions that help folks work around the tax code to kind of get what they need. But this is just a tax on the income, a tax on the earnings of a person that's levied by the state, separate from what's levied by the federal government. Corporate taxes are taxes that businesses pay. It's a tax on the net profit of corporations. Corporations also help to pay for unemployment and workers' compensation premium. Workers' comp is to do with when you are hurt or otherwise unable to work. There's a payout that comes from the government that helps you sustain yourself during that time. Some of the expenses for the corporate taxes can be passed on to consumers through higher prices. So sometimes when there are debates about whether or not to raise tax and who's going to have to pay taxes, companies like to suggest that they don't believe that they should bear the burden of increased taxes, because if they do bear those burdens, then they won't be able to help pass that money along to the citizens in the form of savings, or pass that money along to the folks who work for them in the form of raises. There is revenue that comes from lottery and gambling. We think administrative costs take up about 50% of that money. In many places, the money that comes from lottery and gambling is designated to certain functions. For example, lottery money is often connected to education. A user charge is a source of revenue that states or localities charge in order to use a specific service. So if you want to use the treadmill in the rec center by your house, for example, the city has the right to charge or the ability to charge you to use that treadmill. Or they might make you pay for parking meters or toll rolls or all of these other kinds of things that are user charges you only pay if you use the facility. This is a chart that describes how states versus localities spend their money. How they make their money. Revenue is about how they make the money. So you can see the state revenue sources on the left, and you see that much of it comes from taxes. There's also some intergovernmental money. That means that money is coming from the federal government, so that the money might be coming from different levels of government in the intergovernmental section. Then that we have the user charges we talked about. The insurance trust is in here as well. The insurance trust is money from unemployment compensation, employee retirement, workers' compensation, or other insurance revenue. Then if we look at the local government side, you see that most of that money comes from taxes as well. Some of it comes from intergovernmental sources, so it could be coming from the state or it could be coming from the federal government. And then you see there are charges. One thing that's here in these revenue sources is not reflected in the state is utility charges. So many localities own their own utilities and are able to charge rates that allow them to make a bit of profit in addition to just providing the service. Then this is information about taxes and where the money comes from in taxation. So you see that states get most of their money on the left-hand side. You see that states get most of their money from the individual income tax. They get another great chunk of money from sales taxes, general sales taxes. And then there are a bunch of other taxes that the state uses to collect revenue. On the local side, you see that the vast majority of the money collected by local governments comes from property tax. And then there's a little bit of money from general sales tax. Sometimes localities have an additional tax on top of the state sales tax, so that's represented in that general sales area. And then there are other ways that they collect fees, like motor vehicle licenses or tobacco products, etc. And then this is about how the states and localities spend their money. So states are spending a lot of money on social services, on education, and on the insurance trust. And then localities are spending money, lots of money on education. They're also spending money on utilities, social services, environment, housing, etc. This is a slide about income taxation in the states. So remember I mentioned that there were 7 states without an individual income tax, without a state income tax. Those are represented right here. And then the ones before are represented with the tax rate. So take a moment and find the state where you are from. There has been opposition to rising taxes. So this is a photo of a person who is a part of a Tea Party rally. And the Tea Parties was a kind of an offshoot of the Republican Party. They had this notion that they didn't want people to tread on me. So don't tread on me is what's going on in that flag in the background. But they had many things going on and came into existence after Barack Obama became president of the United States. But one of the things that they had going on was this kind of opposition to taxes. And they had this notion that the government should do as little as possible. Individuals should provide for themselves, and therefore we should not have to increase or collect even taxes. So these are some ways that taxes are limited, or they have suggested that taxes should be limited through property tax limits, income tax limits, etc. The tax limits that have occurred have disproportionately affected local governments. So when you start to, when you choose not to collect taxes from people, The government still has to do its business, and the government can only do its business based on what it gets from the taxes from the revenue it collects. So if they collect less revenue, then the likelihood they can do their job is lower. So local governments have been very much impacted by changes in taxation. Your book talks about how spending cuts came to be managed after the 2000 recession, and wants you to keep in mind that the state governments have to operate in the black. They are not allowed to have deficits. So when there is a downturn in the economy that leads to a downturn in the amount of revenue that comes into a state, then states have to adjust their budget to be able to manage with less money than they had in the past. And that's true at the state level, it's true at the local level as well. So states can cut back on things like travel. In some instances, they have to lay people off work. The same is true at the local government. Sometimes they have to lay people off their jobs or reduce their workforce. In both these instances, there are consequences beyond just laying the person off. For example, if the person lives in the community where they used to work, they might not be able to continue to live in that community once they lose their job. So states have kind of difficult decisions to make about how they are going to manage their budgets once they have less money. And then these are some of the things that they have to balance in their mind as they decide whether or not or how they will balance their budgets. They also consider some retrenchment strategies. So these are also things that they think about or consider when they're trying to figure out whether or how they're going to cut back. In some instances, they might decide not to cut back at all. They might put some of the community needs first and have conversations in the communities about what is important and what's not important. They might try to load shed by privatizing some of the things that are in the government, so the government doesn't have to bear the cost for it anymore and now exists in the private sector. They might reduce their spending on capital. That means that they might build less things or spend less money renovating things. Or they might do a reduction in labor. A reduction in labor, again, is to lay folks off and to dismiss people from their work because they can no longer afford to pay the folks to do the work. State constitutions usually allow for states to finance their capital improvements. So this is capital improvement, again, has to do with building things, building buildings, building schools, etc. And state constitutions generally allow for financing for capital improvements instead of making states or localities pay all at the same time. States and localities might also sell bonds so that they can raise money to do things like build roads or schools or parks. Some of the non-essential functions that happen in government, like mass transit, airport, or housing, can be shifted to private activities instead of being activities that are managed by the government. There are some constitutional restrictions that exist in states. Some of those include debt ceilings that limit the amount of money a state can borrow. General obligation bonds are the bonds that are issued by governments that pledge their full faith and credit, including tax revenues, to repayment. Revenue bonds are bonds issued by the government for specific projects, but backed only by whatever revenue the project generates. So this should remind you a little bit about what we learned in the chapter on federalism, where the general obligation bond is kind of like a block grant, and the revenue bond is kind of like a categorical grant. So the general obligation bond lets the city do like a wide range of things, whereas the revenue bond is for specific projects and not for whatever the city wants to do, not for broad use. The last thing here is industrial development bonds. These bonds are issued by a municipality if they want to purchase land or build facilities for private businesses.